So, good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's Kaavyaalaap session. This is the 14th Kaavyaalaap Vaisistya session organized the Consciousness Studies program at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore. So, Kaavyaalaap is conceptualized by Dr. Sankita Menon, who is the head of the Consciousness Studies program and Dean of Humanities at NIAS, and also Dr. Shankar Rajaraman, who is a postdoctoral fellow at NIAS. He is also a medical doctor and a Sanskrit scholar. Along with Dr. Sankita and Dr. Shankar, I am Meera Menon, and with me there is Preet, both doctoral scholars at NIAS. So we are organizing Kaavyaalaap today, and we have a very interesting speaker talking about Mahishashtakam, and that is Mr. Naresh, who is an assistant professor of linguistics. So we welcome you, sir. Kaavyaalaap is conceptualized in such a manner that we have Vaisistya and Vaividya sessions. So Vaisistya sessions is we have distinguished speakers talk to us about the nuances of poetry from different languages, and Vaividya, where we have different poets coming sharing their poetry in different languages. So without further ado, Dr. Shankar Rajaraman and Preet Kumar, both of them to introduce the speaker and today's topic. So over to you.
Thank you, Meera. The speaker for today's Vaisistya session is Naresh Keerthi, a longtime friend of mine. Naresh Keerthi works on the intellectual and performance traditions of India with a special focus on South India and the Deccan. His areas of research include Sanskrit, Prakrit and Kannada literature and poetology, metaphor theory and pre-modern lexicography. He has conducted his doctoral research on the semantics of sensory terms in Sanskrit at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore. Currently, he is a postdoctoral fellow in the NEAM project at Hebrew University, Jerusalem. Naresh is studying the role of poetic topoi in Kannada and Sanskrit literature from the 15th to the 17th century CE. To introduce the topic for today's talk, I call upon Preet.
Namaskara everyone. Thank you Meera and thank you Shankar sir for the introduction. Reading the Mahishashtakam, Kutti Kavi's Bovine Poetics. A member of the elite circle of tenured scholars from 17th century Kumbakonam, Vancheshwara Dikshita wrote a poem called the Mahishashtaka, 100 verses ostensibly in praise of his buffalo, composed in literary Sanskrit, often deploying complicated puns and other figures. The text is a mine of details about the social and administrative climate of early modern Tamil Nadu. While such a text is of obvious value for cultural historians, the Mahisha Ashtaka and some of its congeners possess peculiar questions within the received framework of Sanskrit poetics. The talk will reflect on the poem, its congeners, and their aesthetic salience. Now I would request Mr. Naresh to start with this talk. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Preet, Shankar and Meera for organizing this. And it's a pleasure to speak again at NIAS, even if it is remotely. And thank you all for coming. I see many friendly faces. It's an honor that Professor Keshav Nadatat, whose translation I've been reading, is here, and friends from NIAS, Shankar, Rana, Professor Dilip Ahuja, and also others, Professor Sundareshwaran, David, Sudha, and many other friends whom I don't recognize. Thank you all for coming. And in terrible times, I think one of the things that holds you in good stead is poetry. And it's a wonderful initiative that you started here, reading both old and new poetry. And I bring you selections from one such poem. As Preet said, I should make a little disclaimer. The Kaavyaalaap poster said that the poet is Naresh Keerthi. I should clarify, I'm only a discussant. The poet is someone else. It's someone much more talented and from a couple of centuries ago. So maybe it's Shankar Rajaraman. He fits the qualification, but it's not me. Like Preet said, this is an unusual text. The name of the text is the Mahisha Shataka, not the Mahisha Ashtaka, the century on the buffalo. That's all right. And what is the context for this poem? So the project that I work with, it's called NEEM, the New Ecology of Expressive Modes. And what that means is that we study texts and authors and ideas from early modern South India, as if these were not things that appeared sui generis, as if they were not sadyojata. And we believe that, of course, they had a past and a future, and that they are connected to each other, and they are not insulated from influences. So the idea of this project and the things we do here is to perform a kind of natural history of texts, authors, and ideas, tracing their before and after. And this is what I'd like to try and do for the Mahisha Shataka. And in the course of it, hopefully we'll also see a few verses. So Preet, can you put on the handout, please?
I hope it's visible, sir.
Yes, I think it's fine.
Perfect.
Okay, so what is the context of the Mahisha Shataka? An administration that doesn't care for scholars, funding and patronage have reduced to a trickle. Tenured academicians who earlier had assured income and tax subsidies no longer enjoy these entitlements. And what can a disgruntled scholar do in such circumstances? Of course, launch a protest. I see that some of you are wondering if this is the talk about the new farm laws, but no, the poem we discussed today is about protest poetry, but it's a different protest. And it does involve a farmer, a rather ill-qualified farmer, if I may say so. And the text is a 17th century Sanskrit poem, the Mahisha Shataka, the Song of the Buffalo. I knew this poem from earlier, but I revisited it recently because there's a new book on it. Next slide, please, Preet. And this is an updated reissue of a translation by the historian Keshavan Vedattat. He calls it The Buffalo Century, Vancheshwara Dikshita's Mahisha Shataka, a political satire for all centuries. This is, it's out from Routledge this year. I warmly encourage all of you to get hold of a copy and read it. The volume also includes a valuable Sanskrit commentary called the Shleshartha Chandrika by the poet's grandson, who is also called, confusingly enough, Vancheshwara Dikshita. And this poet has a connection with Karnataka. He lived well into the 19th century, and he was invited by the king of the Mysore to preside over some yajnas of sorts. And this could be the reason why verses from the Mahisha Shataka were very popular amongst traditional scholars of the old Mysore kingdom. Chinya Ravishankar, in his book, The Sons of Saraswati, recording a biography of the scholar, I think, Chamarajanagara Ramashastri, speaks about how he could recite occasional verses from the Mahisha Shataka, and it's quite surprising because it's a poem from the Tanjavur Kumbhakonam belt, and it seems to have been prevalent in Karnataka. There are other editions of this book. There's a 2010 edition by Professor Radhavallabh Tripathi. He has prepared an edition and has also given English and Hindi translations. There's an edition with the French translation by Pierre Filiosa. I've not been able to examine that. But this is the latest on the Mahisha Shataka, which you have in front of you. A little bit about the poet. The poet was called Vanchanatha Dikshita or Vancheshwara Dikshita or Yajva. The names Dikshita, Yajva, these are all synonymous. He was the member of an elite community of scholars, an Agrahara, that we can locate near Kumbhakonam in Tamil Nadu. And this Agrahara, the Tamil name of the place, is Tiruvisa in Allur. But this place was briefly known as Shahaji Rajapuram. And I have to say it was known as in a qualified way, because I doubt if anyone ever called it that. However, on documents, it was often referred to this way. And this is because this Agrahara was a brainchild of the second Maratha ruler of Tanjavur, Shahaji Bhosle. Now, Shahaji was a Bangalore boy. He was born in your city, and he inherited the rather prosperous kingdom of Tanjavur at a young age, at 13 or 14. He was quite literary, and we have dozens of kavyas, poems, and songs attributed to Shahji. They are in several languages. There's one song in particular which has stanzas, charanas, in 6 different languages. And I've no reason to be uncharitable like some people do and say that, oh, if it's by a king, then someone must have written it for him. And I think most of these kings actually did very little administration. They had all the time to write poems. So I very much believe that he could have written it himself. So Shahaji endowed several colonies of scholars, Agraharas. He named some of them after his parents, Venkoji and Deepamba, and one of them named after himself, Shahaji, the Agrahara called Shahaji Rajapuram, was where we find our poet, Kuttikavi. Now, when Shahaji set up this particular Agrahara, it was kind of his pet project, he invited and settled Brahmana scholars from all over South India and the Deccan. And it was a rather impressive center of scholarly output. Tirvishaynallur had a constellation of scholars, almost all of them polymaths. And in particular, it was a center of this devotional movement called the Namasithanta Movement, which is this theology of Nama Japa, of reciting the sacred names of various deities. And this was an interesting movement because it kind of cemented several sectarian groups. Those who believed in reciting the names of Rama or Krishna or the goddess. It didn't matter which sectarian group you belonged to. This was something that you all could agree upon. And there were scholars like Sridhara Venkatesha, who was known as Ayyaval, and Sadashiva Brahmendra, who belonged to this Agrahara. And they've written treatises about the significance of this Nama Sankirtana, reciting the names of the god. Similarly, Shahaji also invited Ramabhadra Dikshita. Ramabhadra and his father-in-law Chokanatha Dikshita were expert grammarians and poets from another village called Kandaramanikyam. This village was the major Vyakarana workshop. If you wanted to study grammar, you went to somebody here. And these scholars were famous within their lifetime. And Shahaji invited Ramabhadra to move to this new gated community that he built at Tirvishaynallur. It's possible that he similarly invited our poet, Vancheshwara, or the ancestors of our poet from a place near Tiruvarur called Sri Vanchyam, because the name of our poet indicates that their family deity was Vanchanatha or Vanchishwara. And this shrine is not very far. It's all in the Kaveri upper delta region. Now, this poet was informally known as Kuttikavi, which means a little poet. And there's an episode repeated in many places about his precocious skills at composing Sanskrit poems extempore. So he must have been an Ashukavi, and he must have been a poet who composed even from his childhood onwards. So maybe that's why he's called Kuttikavi. Be that as it may, from the poem, one thing is very clear. Kuttikavi saw the shift in fortunes of the Tanjavur kingdom, the Tanjavur Maratha kingdom. So the shift from the relative stability and prosperity in Shahaji's time to the uncertainty and upheavals in the time of Pratapa-Simha and Amarasimha, when they had to deal with the Madurai Nayak, with the French, and eventually with Haidar. And all of these upheavals seem to have happened in our poet's lifetime. And it's this change in fortunes that seems to be the main engine for his poem. That's the cause for his vexation, and that seems to be the motivation for his poem. So as the title makes it clear, the hero or the Nayaka of our poem is the domestic buffalo, the Mahisha. The poet Kuttikavi, after invoking a couple of blessings on the Bhosale rulers, possibly to disclaim any rancor or spite against them, explains that he has resorted to agriculture as his refuge because he cannot rely anymore on the patronage of these kings. And then he goes on very elaborately, very eruditely, and very playfully to put forth 100 odd verses, and they are quite odd, on the buffalo. So let's look at a few of these verses. Next slide, Preet. Yes, so this is from somewhere in the beginning of the text. Nanaji Prabhu Chandra Bhanu Shahajindra Ananda Rayadayo Vidwansah Prabhavo Gata Shrita Sudhi Sandoha Jivatavah Vidyayam Vishabuddhayohi Vrishala Sabhyas Tvidhanintanaha Kim Kurve Amba Krishe Vrajami Sharanam Tvam Eva Vishwavanim. So the verse is addressed to Krishi, agriculture, personified as a goddess. So he says, Amba Krishe, O mother agriculture, Tvam eva sharanam yami. I take refuge in you, I rely upon you. And how is Krishi? She is Vishwavani. She protects all of the world. She sustains all of the world. And why is a poet who's a scholar and who shouldn't be muddying his hands in the field, why is he resorting to agriculture? Because Nanaji Prabhu, Chandrabhanu, Shahajindra, Anandarayadayah. So all of these people, I can recognize a few of them. Anandaraya, who was also Anandaraya Dikshita, he was a scholar who was the minister, the Diwan of the Tanjavur kingdom. He also has an Agrahara named after him. Shahajindra is the king, Shahaji, who was this darling king for people who lived in Tiruvisanallur. And then these other names I'm not so sure about, whether it's Nanaji Prabhu Chandrabhanu or Nanaji Prabhu and Chandrabhanu. They seem to have been similarly important functionaries in the Tanjavur court. So Nanaji Prabhu, Chandrabhanu, Shahajindra, Anandarayadayah, all of these people, Vidvamsah Prabhavaha. They are Prabhavaha, kings, who are also Vidvamsaha. They are also scholars. So they are scholar administrators. Gataha, they've all gone now, they've left the world. And what kind of people were they? Shrita Sudhi Sandoha Jivatavaha. They were a lifeline to the scholars who took their patronage. And they are all gone now, Gataha. Idanintanaha, now I'm in the third line, Idanintanaha Sabhyaha. So the scholars of today, the Sabhyas, the so-called scholars or intellectuals of today, how are they? Vrishalaha. So he uses this very strong word for them. They're bastards. They are scoundrels. Vidyayam Vishabuddhayaha. So they look at education or they look at learning as if it is poison. So they are allergic to learning. Kim kurve amba. So what can I do? What can I ever do in the company of such scholars? So I think it's better that I take to agriculture. So this is the poet's apology for doing agriculture and not being a pandit. And in the next couple of verses, he kind of dilates on this topic. He speaks about how even the Dharma Shastra of Manu says that it's all right in difficult times for a Brahmana to do agriculture firsthand, not merely being this absentee landlord. And he says anyway, to sustain oneself in an ethical way, when one shouldn't gamble and when there's no patronage from the king, what else can you do? And he's actually pointing to this tradition, which is quite old, of scholars also doing other things, of being in the army and of doing agriculture. Okay, so let's look at another verse. And in this one, we can see an interesting play. So we must remember that this is all in the Kaveri Delta, what used to be the old Sora Nadu, the territory of the Cholas, where despite them complaining about Karnataka holding back Kaveri water, they still grow 3 or sometimes 4 crops of rice in 1 year. So it was a very prosperous territory. And the next verse is a caution to an academic. Vidvan ma kuru sahasam shrudu vacho vakshyami yatte hitam tyaktva kamadam atra sairibhapatim nirvyaja bandhum nrinam shrirangabhidapattanam prati sakhe magah jvarasyalayam dure shrihi nikate kritanta mahisha graiveya ghantaravah. So the poet is warning some other scholar who wants to try their fortunes at continuing the scholarship. He says, Vidvan, O scholar, O professor, Ma kuru sahasam. So don't do this rash thing. Don't go on this misadventure. Shrunu yatte hitam vachaha vakshyami. So I'm going to give you this piece of advice. Please listen to me. Kamadam sairiphapatim atra tyaktva Srirangabhida Pattanam Maga Sakhe. Oh friend, don't go searching for some city called Srirangam after dismissing or rejecting this Sairibhapati, this king of buffaloes. What kind of king of buffaloes is he? He is Nrinam Nirvyaja Bandhu. He is this unconditional friend of people. And how else is he? He's Kamada. He fulfills all your desires. He's a very generous buffalo. And he says, Maga Srirangabhida Pattanam. Don't go to Srirangam. There is nothing there. What kind of place is it? He says, Jwarasyalayam. It is a marsh of disease. If you go to Srirangam, you won't get any wealth. If anything, you will catch malaria or something. Dure Shrihi. There is no Shri in Srirangam. There is no prosperity in Srirangam. What do you have there though? Nikate Kritanta Mahisha Graiveya Ghantaravaha. What you can hear over there is the bell on the neck of Yama's buffalo. Kritanta Mahisha. So if you go to Srirangam, you won't get any wealth. On the contrary, what you will get for sure is that you're going to die there. And I think elsewhere in the poem, he speaks about the last I think the Madurai Nayaka or the Vijayanagara Nayaka who lives in Srirangam, and says that he's a totally dissolute king and there's nothing to be got from there. Now, this poem is rather striking, and we can reflect on it for a moment and think about what does it mean for a very traditional scholar, because these were not some special kind of radical iconoclasts. These were traditional scholars, someone who's within the tradition to say such a thing. Surely he's not encouraging people not to go to Srirangam, either the temple or the city anymore, but he's using this as a kind of poetic conceit to speak about how bankrupt the place has become in terms of the scholarly atmosphere and patronage for scholarship. And we can see that most of these Tirvisainallur scholars were all Shastra scholars, and they were all trained in more than one Shastra. And so what they were masters at is at being elusive. They made roundabout connections with other poetry, and their readers, who were equally scholarly and who remembered everything that they read, would immediately see this little insert that refers to some other verse. And this verse too has one such clever allusion. It has a reference to some other famous verse. Next slide, please, Preet. And here you can see, yes. So the first verse is from our text. Vidvan ma kuru sahasam shrunu vacho vakshyami yatte hitam, and so on. And you can see that the next verse, which is from a famous Vaishnava stotra called the Mukundamala, has very similar both in structure and in phraseology. So it's in the same meter in the Shardula Vikridita. Let's look at the first line of each. The Mahishashataka verse goes, Vidvan ma kuru sahasam shrunu vacho vakshyami yatte hitam. And the Mukundamala verse goes, He martyah paramam hitam shrunutavo vakshyami sankshepataha. So the shrunu, vakshyami, and the hitam, which is here, and then which is there at the in the first verse, it's at the end of the line, and in the second verse, it's in the middle of the line. So we can see that he's kind of parodying this verse, especially because the Mukundamala verse is this kind of saturation of devotion towards Vishnu. And you can see in the third line, he says, so give up all other things and chetasi namo narayana iti amum mantram pravardhayadvam. So at least once you recite the name of Narayana in your mind, and then everything will be all right. And what is our poet doing? He's taking this verse and making a kind of cheeky parody, saying, don't go to Narayana's place. All you will get over there is malaria. And Kutti Kavi is neither the first nor the last poet to do something like this. There's a long tradition of poets who are capable of this kind of playful criticism, and both from within the tradition, poets like Kshemendra, as well as, of course, the Jaina poets are experts at doing this, and they even sometimes are quite harsh in criticizing the sectarian practices of other traditions. But what does it mean when somebody from within the tradition says this? And also, what does it mean that it was received within the tradition in the right spirit as poetry, and as funny poetry at that? That gives us something to think about. Okay, so let's look at another verse. Now, after a few natural descriptions of the buffalo and what it does, and after complaining about the maladministration, he goes on into a series of very involved puns, and using the device of the pun, which Sanskrit allows for, he compares the buffalo to Vishnu, to Rama, to Krishna, and to a scholar of one sect, to a scholar of another sect, to a Mimamsaka, to a grammarian, and so on. But first we have a simple verse, because this verse kind of is on the theme of the buffalo being king, and how he's no less than a king, and he's maybe better than some other human kings. So the verse goes, Goshtham te nripamandiram shakradapi prayena kasturika prithvi renu samutkarastu vapushah pratyagra pishtataka निर्व्याजोपकृति प्रवीण मनस मानेन लब्धोन्नतेः सर्वं ते महिषाधिराज तदिदं भूषा विशेषायते. So he's telling the buffalo, Mahishadhiraja, so O Emperor Buffalo, Sarvam tadidam te bhusha visheshayate. All of these things only enhance your beauty. They only are ornaments to you. And what are these things? Goshtham ten ripamandiram. So this cowshed is your palace, it's your mansion. Shakradapi prayena kasturika. And the manure, the dung, is the fragrant perfume, is musk. Prithvi renu samutkarahatu vapushaha pratyagra pishtatakaha. And the mud that is caked on your body is fresh talcum powder, pishtataka. So for you, O Mahishadhiraja, O Buffalo King, who are manena labdhonnatehe, you have attained great heights, unnati, by mana, because of your pride in one case, and in another case, because you're very tall, because you're very big. So you're tall because you're tall. And also, what does he do? Nirvyaja upakriti pravina manasaha. So this Mahisha, this king, he is an expert at nirvyaja upakriti. So he does a favor to everyone. He doesn't expect a salary. He doesn't expect you to do anything in return. And he does favors to you. He plows your field and he pulls your cart or whatever. And the poet says that no king is like you. He may have a mansion, he may have perfumes, he may confer charity, but you are the best, King Mahisha. And what we can see is, again, this kind of dejection at how kings weren't patronizing scholars anymore, and how in the poet's opinion, all kinds of undeserving ministers and scholars were getting the upper hand. So the poem is this kind of bitter note in that vein. Okay, so after that, he has quite a long and bitter complaint about the revenue officers, and I think we can look at a verse about that. Just a moment. Can you go back to the previous verse for a moment, Preet? Yes. Also in this verse, so Prithvi Renu Samutkarastu, the little bit Prithvi Renu, it's too small to call it an intertext, but it does remind you of a verse from the Mukundamala, the stotra we saw in the previous verse. There's a verse that starts, that goes Prithvi Renu Ranuf Payamsi Kanika Phalgus Phulingon Laghu. So clearly our poet Kuttikavi had this other devotional poem in mind while he was writing this. Yeah, now we can look at the poem about the bureaucrats whom we all love so much. So this one goes, Unmatta Dravinadhikara Vashata Stambangata Durgunaihi Sanjata Vrishaleshata Virachitan Nyayati Bhutyadritaha Kechichringabhritaha cha Sampriti Subhedharadhamaha Kasara Jeshta Kim Bhavato Vada Twamathava Satyam Kanishta Ime. So the poem is about the Subedars, the Suba being an administrative unit, so some kind of revenue officers. So Subedar Adhamaha, so these Richard Subedars, so he's describing them first. He says they are Unmatta Dravinadhikara Vashataha. They are drunk with Dravina, with wealth, and Adhikara, and their position, their official stature. And Stambhangata Durgunaihi, with all of these wicked qualities, they're almost senseless, they are insensitive. Sanjata Vrishaleshataha Subedaradhamaha. So they've gotten this stature of being Subedar because of this false king. And I think this is a kind of a motive of this time. There was a major struggle for the throne after the time of Shahaji and after his successor Sharabhoji. There were these kings Pratapasimha and Amarasimha who were all who had to somehow assert their legitimacy, and so there were scholars who were in their favor and scholars who weren't in their favor, and all kinds of name calling happened. So this could be a reference to the king that he doesn't recognize as king. So they have become Subedars because of some fake king, and Virachita Anyaya, they do all kinds of misdemeanors, and Atibhuti Adritaha, all they respect is money, and they are conferred with a lot of money. So they're corrupt and they take bribes. Kechit Shringabhritaha. And some of them, they even have a trumpet. So Shringa is this horn-shaped musical instrument. So it's probably a trumpet of some sort. And so some of them are so pompous that like the king, they have somebody going in front of them calling on the trumpet. Samprati Subhedaradhama. These Subedars, these horrible Subedars, Kasara, O buffalo, please tell me, Vadatvam, Kim Bhavataha Jeshtaha Kanishtaha va ime. Are these Subedars your older brothers or are they your younger brothers? Please tell me the truth. So it's not very clear when you just look at the poem in one register about. So of course he's calling them buffaloes, but surely there has to be more to this than meets the eye. So I've tried to kind of take apart all the features of the poem. Next slide, please, Preet. Yes. So here we can see how all these adjectives apply in one column. It applies to the bureaucrats, and in the other it applies to a buffalo. So Unmatta Dravinadhikara Vashataha. In the case of the ministers, of course, they are drunk with power and wealth. In the case of the buffaloes, they are Dravina Adhikara Vashataha. So when they are Unmatta, when they are excitable, what happens to the bureaucrats is that they are Stambhangata Durgunaihi. So they are insensitive because of their vices, because of their wickedness. In the case of the buffalo, when it's excitable, it's tied up to a stambha. It's tied up to a post with a guna, with some kind of tattered rope, durguna. And these subedars are sanjata vrishaleshataha. So they've reached their stature because of this fake king. And in the case of the buffalo, they are born to a stud buffalo, vrishalesha. In the case of the bureaucrats, they are virachita anyaya, so they do all kinds of impropriety, and atibhuti adrataha, and they grow rich with this corrupt wealth, with these bribes. In the case of the buffalo, they are virachita anya aya. So they enrich the other person. They create aya or income for anya, for others. And they are ati bhuti adrataha. They love to roll about in the ash, bhuti. And these bureaucrats, they are shringabhritaha. They have a trumpet, meaning they have a trumpet going in front of them. In the case of the buffalo, it is a shringabhrit. Some of them, they have horns. So using all of these similarities created through shlesha or pun, the poet has a doubt and he's asking, so tell me, were these bureaucrats born before you or were they born after you? You seem to be so similar to each other. And so after this kind of criticism of the administration and how terrible it is, he goes on to compare then it's just verses that demonstrate the kind of infinitely flexible wordplay that's possible in Sanskrit. And he shows his scholarship in all kinds of fields. And one of these is a very nice verse. He compares the buffalo to a baby. So this verse, it goes, Dhatryutsangatale vimunchasi muhu vinmutram astatrapam Dhatsenapi apalalam asyam anisham snehena samvardhyase shankhavyapi payah pibasi anudinam tasmat adantam mukhe vatsashri mahishendra balakamiva tvam vikshya nandami aham. So he says, Vatsashri mahishendra, darling baby buffalo, balakamivatvam vikshya. I look at you as I would look upon a baby, a child, and nandami, and it pleases me no end. And, why is the buffalo like a child? So dhatrusangatale, on the surface of the earth, astatrapam, with no shame, vinmutram vimunchasi. So you urinate and you defecate on the earth with no shame. Dhatse napi apalalam asyam. Your asya, your face, is never empty of palala, of straw. And anisham snehena samvardhyase, and you're fed oil, you're nourished with oil. Shankhavyapi payah pibasi anudinam. Every day you drink water submerged in the pool up to your head, up to your forehead. Tasmat adantam mukhe vatsa, and you're always chewing the cud. So vatsa, or calf, or baby, Mahishendra, king buffalo, I look upon you as a child. Now, surely children don't submerge themselves in ponds, at least not infants. So we have to see how the poet has managed this, and we can see the two registers in a moment. Next slide, please, Preet. Yes. So here we can see how, using the pun again, he has managed the two registers of the poem. So dhatri utsangatale vinmutram astatrapam vimunchasi. So in the case of the buffalo, we also already saw it. But in the case of the child, the dhatri is the earth, but the dhatri is also the mother or the caretaker. So you sit on the lap of your caretaker and you pee and poop like a baby does. And then dhatse na api apa lalam asyam. Your face, asya, is never apa lala, is never free of lala or saliva, drool. Your mouth is always drooling. Snehena samvardhyase, you're brought up with great love. Shankhavyapi payaf pibasi. So this is a reference to this little kind of drinking cup, what we could call a sippy, that was traditionally used to feed infants before they had teeth. That was in the shape of a little conch shell. So babies are fed with these little cups. Shankhavyapi payaf pibasi. Tasmat adantam mukhe. And you have no teeth in your mouth. So vatsa shri mahishen balakamiva tvam vikshya nandami aham. So because of all of these features that are similar only because of the pun and nothing else, buffalo is like a child. And this is a rather simple example. The others are more stratospheric, and there's examples where he's compared to Shastrins, to a scholar of Mimamsa Shastra, to a scholar of Vedanta Shastra, and so on, which have much more involved puns, and they don't lend themselves so well to translation. And that's about the last sample I brought for today. And our poet, he also in the first half of the poem, he has a verse which is a rather graphic description of how the buffalo goes, and he hunts down the she buffalo, and then he tries to mount her, and so on. And anyone seeing such a verse outside the context of this kavya would say that it's in rather poor taste. But there's reasons why he's composed it that way, and it's connected to the tradition of these Shataka poems. And the archetype of these Shataka poems, I think we can identify two kinds of archetypes. One is Mayura's Surya Shataka, which is 100 verses on the sun, and it's probably from the 7th or 8th century. And the same poet in one of, we have a verse attributed to Mayura in one of the early anthologies, Vallabhadeva Subhashitavali, where he describes the intercourse of a goat. And I suspect that with the verse on the buffalo's intercourse, Kutikavi is kind of tipping his hat to the author of the Surya Shataka, who's kind of the pioneer of this genre. And the rest of the poem is more or less along these two lines. Either he's complaining about the kings and the revenue officers who take away all of the hard-earned grain that this buffalo is cultivating for him, or he praises the buffalo, comparing him to Vishnu, Shiva, Ganesha, Rama, Mimamsaka, Ramanujacharya, and so on. And it's all done in very clever ways. So what I'd like us to reflect about, and I hope it can come up in the discussion, is how do we look at such a poem from a perspective of Alankara Shastra, of poetics, even traditional poetics. What is the purpose of writing a poem like this? What is the rasa experience elicited by a poem like this, and both the individual verses in it and the whole poem at large, what it's supposed to be like? And I think that's the interesting thing to think about. And the early exemplars, I don't want to say too much about this unless it comes up. The early exemplars of this Shataka genre, they were mostly devotional. And the first, like I said, the oldest known one is about the sun. It's all in praise of Surya. And then there's a Chandi Shataka attributed to Bana Bhatta. And then there's similar ones on the Buddha, on the Tara. There's a Jina Shataka, and so on. But we find closer to our times, like in the Sandesha poems, which starts off with the cloud Sandesha, and then a bird Sandesha, and then moves on to all kinds of crazy things. You have a crow Sandesha and a smoke Sandesha. It's the same with the Shataka poems. So from the 19th century, there's a Shataka on the broomstick. And in this century, someone's written, I think a professor from JNU, Upendra Rao, he has a Shataka on dust. And it's understandable. He lives in New Delhi. So the question is, these are not radical departures. They're actually very traditional things to do. But what we have to pose to ourselves is how would Alankara Shastra accommodate poems like this, and how we are supposed to think about them and how we are supposed to receive them. Yes, that's all I had to say, and we could maybe open it up for discussions.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. That was at once, say, funny and punny. And thank you for introducing us to Mahesha Shataka, and quite an intriguing of political context and satire going on in there. And today we have some very distinguished scholars like David Fluman, sir, and Mr. Keshavan Velitat. So thank you all for being here. And we will definitely take questions. So if you have them, please put it up in the chat box and we will take them one by one. Or you could also alternatively raise your hand and we will unmute you and you could ask them. We are open for comments, questions, any suggestions that you might have. So we will take the questions and comments in the chat box, or you could alternatively use the raising your hand option.
And thank you so much, Naresh, and that was wonderful. And I'm really sorry for misreading the very text.
Oh, it's fine.
Mahesh Ashtaka, because I've been listening to Shweta Mayura Ashtaka in the morning. So it's an 20th century Ashtaka on the Shweta Mayura by a Telugu poet. So I happen to misread it as Ashtaka.
It's perfectly fine.
Ashtaka is 8 and Shataka is 100. So yeah.
Right.
Great. So Prashant Revankar has a question. I have unmuted you, sir. So could you please go ahead?
Yeah, it was nice hearing to Naresh Keerthi sir about the Mahesh Shatikam. I just wanted to know what makes Sanskrit language unique. Is it the Chandasu or any other feature makes it so unique than compared to the other languages? Hope this comes in the part of our discussion.
Okay, thank you, Prashant, for your question. Chandas is the metric structure, meter and prosody, and it's a feature of Sanskrit as well as of the other Indian languages, and most classical languages which had oral poetry have some of the other form of chandas. So, but it's certainly the variety of chandas that we see in Sanskrit is very impressive, and Shankar could tell us more about how the combination of the vrittas, where we have the light and heavy syllables, and the moraic meters, the matra meters, they offer us more than one kind of rhythmic structure in poetry, and you can do all kinds of musical things with them. So forget the meaning, it just gives you these melodic templates that makes it easy to recite and memorize. And in some cases, you can see that the poetry and the lyrical quality is conveyed even just from the choice of sounds and the choice of metric structure. The best exemplar for this would be the Gita Govinda, which doesn't have ideas that are too complex, but just in the smooth and elegant choice of words and the arrangement. So when you have Lalita Lavanga Lata Parishila Nakomala Malaya Samire, even if you don't recognize any of these words, you know that this is poetry and this is not somebody yelling in a traffic junction. And so yes, surely meter is one of the things that makes Sanskrit poetry very interesting. But the thing is, I don't know if this uniqueness is necessarily a good thing, but the fact that after the 9th century, we see that in Sanskrit, there's this obsession with rare meanings, and both for well-known words, and you see the emergence of these new koshas, dictionaries, where monosyllabic words are attributed all kinds of meanings. And many poets learn this, which makes it possible to take this art of shlesha, of punning, to crazy heights. And that makes it possible in Sanskrit and also other languages that use a lot of Sanskrit. So to a lesser extent, it's possible in Kannada. And I think to an equal extent, it's possible in Prakrit and languages like Telugu and Malayalam that use Sanskrit. There are devices like pun in many, many, many languages of the world. But I think the Sanskrit poets, definitely, some of them, they took to this contagious disease. Yes.
Sundaram Ramachandran.
I've unmuted, sir.
Yeah.
There is this parable, the time of Saint Jnaneshwar, about the buffalo reciting the Vedas. So,
right.
Are there any links? And like all the scholars, they said how it's a supposedly they think about unity of life, but they can't believe it. So I guess then Jnaneshwar says that you are talking about unity of life. it probably knows more about unity of life than what you guys proclaim unity of life, but you basically you don't believe a miracle when it happens. So are there relations between indirect?
It's an interesting idea for sure. I'm I don't think that our poet was thinking about this in particular, but sure, and it's already in the case of Jnaneshwar, it's interesting that when he's challenged, and because I think they challenged that his parents were excommunicated by the community, and so when his father gives him the Upanayana ceremony and teaches him to recite the Veda, the other scholars they challenge his qualification for this. And then he says, but if you believe in Advaita, then it's what I was going to say is that it's interesting that he uses a buffalo and not some more traditional animal like the cow to recite the Veda. But I don't know if our poet was thinking about it, because after all, in our poem, the buffalo is not reciting the 100 verses. The 100 verses are about the buffalo. So nonetheless, it's very interesting to the fact that they choose all these unlikely candidates. That's what is interesting.
Thank you.
Shankar seemed to have something to say.
Yeah, sure, sir.
Yeah. Thank you, Naresh, for your talk. I had two questions. When a Sanskrit poet chooses an insignificant object, such as the Mahisha or a Sammarjani, the broom, and plans to write a century of verses, or say 1,000 verses, as in the case of Paduka Sahasra, after some time, does he run out of ideas and has to depend a lot on pun to fill up his verses? That was the first question. The second is just an observation. You had this Graiveya Gantaravaha in the second verse. I have heard this verse. I'm not well versed in Tamil, but in Telugu, but I have heard this verse by Srinatha, which has Vaivasvata Vaha Mahisha Graiveya Gantadvanul.
It's possible.
So I wanted to know, is it possible that he was
yes, actually,
Mahisha Graiveya Ganta, three words, and the entire verse being in Shardula Vikridita there also.
Right.
I think it is Shardula Vikridita, not Matteva Vikridita, but in any case, at the same place, Mahisha Ganta and Graiveya occur in both. So
yes, thank you. That's
is there a possibility?
It's possible. I think there's always when we identify these intertexts, especially for a part of a line, there's always this danger that through some kind of sympathetic magic, even if there isn't an intertext, we create an intertext by juxtaposing these things together. Because who knows, if anyone who's writing in the Shardula or the Matebha meter, I think there's even a verse by some poet from Tamil Nadu which has Vaikuntha Kanthirava. So does Graive Ghantarava correspond to Vaikuntha Kanthirava? Well, it's anybody's guess. And sometimes they may just come up with this without having read the other poet.
Yeah.
So, but the idea of it being an intertext of Srinatha is very compelling. And I think this is something that has not been studied enough, which is the influence of Bhasha poetry on Sanskrit poets in South India in this second half of the second millennium. We see that, for example, I think that from the same constellation of scholars, Samarapungava Dikshita, I have a feeling, I'm fairly certain, that he had read Krishnadeva Raya's poetry. And there are intertexts of the Amukta Malyada in his Sanskrit poem. And we just don't look for this, I think, because of exactly the reasons that, the NEEM project does what it does, is that people looked at, historians of Telugu looked at the influences of older Telugu poetry on later Telugu poetry, or at best the influence of Sanskrit on Telugu poetry. But they never thought of the possibility of the influence of Tamil or Telugu or Kannada on later Sanskrit. In a verse that I didn't use in our reading today, he says, those people who criticize you, may they develop worms in their mouth and their hands. Now, you can tell me, Shankar, as far as I know, I haven't seen this expression in Sanskrit. However, you have it in Hindi and you have it in Kannada. And I suspect You have it in Marathi. So in Kannada, you would say nin vaige hula bida, kaige hula bida. And this poet, he was from a Kannada family. There were these Hoysala Kannada Brahmanas who came probably in late Vijayanagara times to Tamil Nadu, and probably they continue to speak Kannada at home. So it's very much a possibility, and I think these connections need to be found out much more. And as for your first question, thank you for asking it, and I invite you to answer it, because I've never written 100 poems on any topic in Sanskrit, and you've probably done it. But you're right. I think when you choose these unconventional themes, let me put it that way, and for that matter, even if you choose conventional themes, so let's look at the early exemplars. There's the Amaru Shataka, which is on Shringara episodes, and the Bhallata Shataka, which are these Subhashitas full of Anyoktis. And the advantage there is that it's a more open-ended theme. So if you're talking about love, it's a kind of theme into which you can build any kind of episode and write a verse. So writing 100 verses or 1,000 verses isn't a problem. Similarly, Bhallata Shataka, you use the example of some creature or some object and use it in an oblique way to give advice, so to write a Subhashita. So it's similarly an open-ended theme. But yes, like you said, how many features are there about a buffalo or a broom or a crow that you can write poems about? And I think it's best if we treat these poems as being Muktaka anthologies. So each of these, if you receive it as a standalone poem, and therefore each poem is kind of a trigger for a standalone rasa episode, then I feel that is better rather than try and look for some kind of cumulative aesthetic effect. Because what is the cumulative aesthetic effect of 10 verses which compare the buffalo through pun to King and to Chanda Sahib and to Shivaji and to a Mimamsaka and so on? So I suspect that's what the poet's intention is, and maybe that's how we have to receive these poems. And yes, the pun is this amazing tool that people like Kutti Kavi and you can employ to do this.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Amritavalli has a question.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. That was very enlightening and it was fun and joyful. So thank you for that. I had two questions, actually. The first is, do we find any verses that have a more positive leaning? So for example, did he do anything like, look, these are the lessons from the humble buffalo or from Mahisha Raja that this administration can employ? That would be a very clear indication of like who the intended audience is and what the purpose of the poem was. That's my first. And my second question is, isn't it ironical that since you said it's a time of reduced patronage, how is it that the Mahisha Shataka has made it across time and we're still able to read it? So it might have got some traction, some fame. So how is it that it made it, even though it was there wasn't much patronage? Is that because of the format, because it's written in the Shataka format? So what are your thoughts?
Thank you. Both great questions. So the first question, I wish he did that, but I also feel that, as is often the case with some of us, we are ready to criticize, but it's not like we always have solutions to offer. So he has another poem called the Ashirvada Shataka, where he invokes the blessings of all kinds of whole gods, and it's addressed in the plural. So this Shataka goes, may they bless you, and it's in the plural. So the addressee is in the plural. So we don't know if we don't know if that verse was before this one, but again, there's some verses there which employ the same kind of punning technique, and they are addressed like to the 9 planetary gods, to all the gods you can think of, to the Dikpalakas and so on. So that's kind of this nice feel-good poem. There's nothing sarcastic about it. So it's interesting to speculate. We don't know if, for example, he composed that verse and it was cold-shouldered in the court and it was not received well. He didn't get a promotion. And then he said, oh yeah, really? You don't take my poem? And then he wrote this, look, if you don't receive my poetry, I can praise the buffalo. Or if he kind of wrote it when he was in a better mood. But yeah, I don't think he has a poem describing how people should do their job, because I think that was not his purpose. Even this poem, it's not his manifesto about how to improve the state. This poem is him having fun. He probably wrote it over a bored weekend during some lockdown or something. As to your second question, it's a super question again. And I think it's something that we should wonder about all such poems that are critical of their time, let alone the poem. Think about the poet. Why didn't Kshemendra die an untimely death for being critical of the bureaucrats of his time? And how come his texts, and I mentioned Kshemendra with good reason, because his manuscripts, they've made it all the way to Tanjavur and fairly long ago. So one of his texts, so for those of you who don't know, Kshemendra is a 11th, 12th century poet from Kashmir, very prolific. And besides texts of Alankara Shastra, he also produced these summaries of the Ramayana, Mahabharata, Brihat Katha, and he had several short satirical poems criticizing all kinds of people. So he hated goldsmiths, and he thought there were lots of hypocritical pundits, so he's critical of academia. He particularly doesn't like Bengali scholars, and so he has bunches of poems criticizing all kinds of people. And the question is, why did these texts survive? So I can only speculate, and I can give you a pessimistic speculation and an optimistic speculation. And I suspect the pessimistic one is more likely to be true. The pessimistic speculation is that, fortunately or unfortunately, lots of texts don't get read. Nonetheless, they get circulation. So there weren't enough people to read these texts and then get irritated by them and to burn them. But there were enough people to read them and find them funny or find them to have some merit and pass them on. Because we find many of these in the Jaina Bhandars, and you can think about it. So why does a Jaina monk need such texts? Because a Jaina monk is a complex being like you and me. They don't spend all their time reading the Tattva Vinishchaya Vivarana or whatever. They also like to read fun poetry. And thank God for that, because so many things wouldn't have survived otherwise. And I don't know if there's anything special about the Shataka genre. I just think that all kinds of things survived. I think it speaks to the intellectual climate that you could say things. And if you look at, I mean, even other kinds of poems, people, so in the Mudra Rakshasa, for example, Chanakya, he always addresses Chandragupta as Vrishala. And that was, it's kind of an affectionate term. If you probably call your friend by some unmentionable term, because it's a sign of your friendship. It's not a sign of disrespect. And they were fine with it, I think.
Okay. Thank you, sir. So before we come back to the questions, we have a comment from Mr. David Shulman, sir. So, sir, if you would like to unmute, and we would be honored to hear a comment from yourself, if you're there. David, sir, are you there?
I'm trying to unmute, sir.
Unmuting him?
You're unmuting me now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, yes, sir, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, first of all, Naresh, thanks for the talk. It was a very lovely talk. And it's a fantastic text. And also the Tiruvangiam temple and its god is part of this whole picture that we should mention. I think one of the very striking things is that these Shatakas, that is to say 17th, 18th century, even 19th century Shatakas, they're different than the classical models for the most part. They're not really a genre at all, actually. It's a formal mechanism of counting 100 verses.
That's right.
Yeah, but within them, there are these clusters. You could call them thematic clusters that are worth noticing. And one of them has to do with this sense of political instability or political satire or vicious attack upon the political order. And that also extends to the gods in the temple. In Andhra, perhaps the most famous of all the Andhra Shatakas is the Kasura Purushottama Kavi Andhra Nayaka Shatakamu, which is an attack on the god of the temple god who is allowing his temple to be desecrated by what are called the Turushkas and other people. He just sits there silently. 100 verses of rather fierce attack upon the god, which are clearly, which is clearly meant to be something a little bit like in the Mahisha Shataka, something of a maybe double register in which this kind of ninda stuti element is.
Right. So it's a criticism of love.
Yeah, that's right. In some cases, that also may help to explain the fact that that Kutikavi was not ostracized or executed or any of the other things
Right.
that the Maratha kings could have done, right?
Yes, it's you're absolutely right that the Shataka is kind of a structural label that we use to collapse together many different genres, and the southern Shatakas, which all are marked by this, I think it's called a Makutam. They all have the same refrain. They're quite different from the Sanskrit Shatakas, and there are even some late Sanskrit Shatakas which follow that typology. They start doing that.
Great. Thank you, David, sir, for that comment. And now I'll take a question from Vijay Lakshmi. Picker. Could you please unmute her?
Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you, ma'am.
Yeah, I wanted a discussion. I mean, on Alankar Shastra and the rasa that I think I felt that there was clearly, of course, the Hasya rasa, but I would like a discussion on what other people think about this. That's all. Thanks.
Okay.
Yes, unfortunately, we don't have a new rasa for something like satire or sarcasm or parody or things like that, because it's not hasya in its simple way. Because when you're in the first part of the text, at least, you're complaining, and there's no hasya there. It's very serious. But then you kind of soften it or sweeten it later with all of these hasya comparisons. So I doubt if we can identify a single sthai, of course, but if you say that there's a very clever, very scholarly 100 verses on a buffalo, just from this description, you think that, it must be a joke. He must have done it on a lark. But it could also be that it's very serious, because there are other poets who use their poetry as their truest and most authentic mode of expression. So a slightly older contemporary, Nilakantha Dikshita, they say that he wrote other Shastra texts. I think there's some Shaiva Tantra text that we have found, and there's supposed to be a grammar commentary, which we haven't found. But he's very eloquent, and all of his views about individuals, about the human condition, about bhakti, about society, it all comes in his kavyas. And I think so it's also serious business. It's not just hasya in some facile way. It's
may I just I don't think hasya is anyway facile. Hasya generally also conveys mockery, sarcasm. For me, I mean, that hasya is not only why should we limit hasya is my question.
Well, it's not about us limiting it. It's about how Alankara Shastra describes it. And if you think that it encompasses all of these other things as well, that's very interesting. That probably kind of enlarges the scope of hasya and its aesthetic possibilities.
I'm just, this is just my way of looking at rasa, that we need to modernize it and bring it to today's, when we look at it today, we have to look at it from here. That's what I feel. And we can bring in, it is hasya. I can't see any other, any other rasa fitting in, but we can widen the scope of rasa to fit our, I think. That is a quality of any theory, that it should be amenable to interpretations and opening up possibilities.
Thank you.
All. Yeah. That's just a view,
Okay, great. Thank you, ma'am. So we will now take one last question from Sudha Gopalakrishnan. And let me also say that if there are any further questions or suggestions, we will be opening up a WhatsApp group, Kaavyaalaap, and you could probably put your suggestions and questions and all of those there. So yeah, we'll take one last question. Sudha Gopalakrishnan, ma'am, please go ahead.
Actually, my question was more than answered by Naresh in most of these comments, but I also would like to say that hasya is serious business. It is not just laughter. It is not just about, there's lots of many undercurrents and many shades in hasya on that point. And also this itself is not just hasya, it is a veiled invective. So my question at that time was, how was it received during its own time? Did it serve a purpose? But then I think Naresh did answer that question, so I don't want him to, unless if he wants to say something, and also perhaps the one who translated this poem is also here. So if he would like to say something also, whether Naresh would like to say this, I'd like. That's what I want to say.
Thank you, Sudha Chechi. Yes, it would be wonderful if Professor Keshavan has something to add about the text, both from the historical perspective and just the aesthetic experience of reading it and translating it. And about the transmission of the text, yes, it seems to have been very long-lived, and it traveled wide, at least in South India. It was well known in Karnataka. And there's supposed to be a third Shataka by this poet, which is still in manuscript in Tanjavur, called the Dhati Shataka. I don't know what it is about. But these two, the Ashirvada Shataka, which is rather tame, and this excellent one, these two have survived, and they've been printed and reprinted often. Many Pandits used to know verses by heart. So this one has been quite successful, I must say. And yes, if we would love it if Professor Keshavan has something to say about the text.
I can't quite see Professor Keshavan here.
Okay, maybe he left then, yeah.
Possibly. So anyway, so I think for now, that'll be all the questions. If there are any more questions, suggestions, comments, we'll take it in the WhatsApp group as well. So in that case, thank you again, sir, for this wonderful talk. And may I request Preet to make a formal vote of thanks.
Thank you again. Before Preet says, Kaavyaalaap team, great job. Thanks for having me. I had fun speaking here on the Mahisha Shataka, and thanks to everyone who came.
Thank you so much, sir. On behalf of Team Kaavyaalaap, the National Institute of Advanced Studies and CSP program, I would like to thank you for agreeing to talk and give a wonderful and insightful lecture on a lesser known poetic work, the Mahisha Shatakam. And I would like to thank Professor Sangeeta Menon, the head of School of Humanities at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, for her constant love and support. And all of you today for being here and gracing today's event and being present and asking wonderful questions and adding on to the value. Thank you so much, one and all, and looking forward to our next program. Our next event is on the 26th of January. It's Kaavyaalaap Vaisistya, and looking forward to one and all present there. Thank you so much.